It's what you hearing. It's what you hearing. Listen. It's what you hearing. Listen. It's what you hearing. Listen.
Ladies and gentlemen.
X gon' give it to you. Fuck, wait for you to get it on your own. X gon' deliver to you. Knock, knock, open up the door to spill. With the non-stop pop and stainless steel.
MrCropper here. We're going to be doing some Rationality rules. That's his YouTube channel. My views on morality. Is it objective? Now, okay, let's come back to this 37-second mark. Let's go here and listen to what he says at the end, to tie it all up.
Or, let's face it, lack thereof. Then for all intent and purposes, what's the problem? Nature has made it so that we are born with axiomatic oughts, and while, again, this is intellectually dissatisfying, we just have to get on with it. As inconvenient as it might be, we are...
So he says, intellectually, you might not want to take these things for granted. You might want to go to some floating Platonic realm of logic and rules, but, as a matter of fact, we are born with pain receptors and pleasure and so on. These are actual metaphysical facts, alright? So he's good on that. That's good.
Are not born with a blank slate, and all moral discourse must, finally, accept this brute fact.
Alright, we're not born with a blank slate. Now that's just... he's ruling out blank slate because we have some inherent values, namely pain and pleasure. Now, I just want to point out that this argument is not going to satisfy D-types. D2 types particularly, but people who want to disintegrate everything are simply going to point out sadomasochists, right? People who like to cause pain to themselves particularly, right? And there's plenty of that. There was the hair shirt people in the Dark Ages that drink dishwater, and they wore hair shirts, and they slept on beds of nails. So there's plenty of people who are willing to use their pain receptors as a way to be moral. Okay? So, how are you going to address those people? See? So I'm going to be able to address them with my philosophy, but he is stuck when those people come around and wear a hair shirt or something. He's going to have to tell them that they're immoral, apparently, because he's got axiomatic moral data or fiber. He's got some sort of axiomatic moral stuff that makes pleasure the thing and makes pain the bad thing. So, well, I'll get to my bit eventually.
Anyhow, to sum up, I do not believe, for example, that it's always morally wrong to murder. There's no transcendent objective law that we must abide by, and I don't believe that we must do anything. But I do believe, as a matter of scientific fact, that we are born with intrinsic axiomatic values,
Alright. Now, the intrinsic axiomatic values are the pain and pleasure, right? And the things that give us pleasure, whatever that is. Like for men, looking at, having, holding, dealing with, and using tools gives us pleasure. Not all of us, but a surprising, very, very surprising tendency towards tools for men. Women, if you find a woman using a tool, she's probably using it wrong, honestly. And men couldn't really care less about the 5 or 7 different personal relationships going on within a group. And the women are extremely interested in that. That's all they're interested in, is relationships with other people, because that's their main job. That's how they make a living, is by having a relationship with a man. And their job is to raise kids, which is having a relationship with kids. So women are very much into relationships, men not so much. Men are more into tools. These things give women pleasure, these things give men pleasure. Are they intrinsic axiomatic values? I say that this is the nature that you are born with, right? You're born into a particular nature. You're not born necessarily with axiomatic values. Your nature determines what your values will be. That's what he's trying to say, and I accept the direction he's going in. I'm just pointing out that the sadomasochists are going to give him a hard time, and he's not going to have an answer for him.
goals, and inclinations, or in other words, axiomatic oughts, and that we construe contingent oughts in reference to these axiomatic oughts and perceived facts. And because those facts can be erroneous, so too can the contingent oughts predicated upon them.
In other words, we're not omniscient.
Or to put this more personally, while we all have different values and preferences, and we all believe different things, the vast majority of us have the axiomatic ought of not wanting to suffer, and consequently, we want to live in a world.
See, the vast majority of us. Now, I'm not particularly satisfied with an ethical theory for the vast majority of us, right? I want an ethical theory for humans. Now, my ethical theory, of course, well, let's get to it.
In which no matter who we were conceived by, no matter what genetic disposition we inherited, and no matter what environment we grew up in, we were given ample love, patience, and opportunity. And so given this mutual acceptance of what is good, let's work together to create a better future. Now, the last thing I want to say is that I'm not entirely sure on how you'll respond to my views, as so far as I can tell, they're largely unique.
That's interesting. Alright, so we have the privilege, ladies and gentlemen, of dealing with unique views here. This is not a rehash of some other philosopher or set of philosophers. Alright, now that we've got this on the table, we are going to go back to the 37-second mark and continue from there. But, just to put that on the table, I think his main issue is going to be answering that tiny minority. Because he says the vast majority of humans, blah, blah, blah. Now, if this theory is set, if that's it, if it's good enough there, if this is a summation of it, then we can say that it's not going to satisfy the D2 types. Now, maybe that's not a problem. Maybe we can never satisfy them. So maybe your theory shouldn't try to get them satisfied. Maybe your theory shouldn't worry about them. That's the ground I stand on. Alright.
As many of you are already aware, in the current state of moral philosophy, we have three subject areas. Metaethics, which is concerned with where morality comes from.
Where morality comes from, right? So let's look at that term, metaethics, if it's concerned with where morality comes from and what moral terms
And what moral terms mean.
What moral terms mean. So, where morality comes from. And what moral terms mean. Okay. It's my view that these three areas of ethics that he has are not three different areas of ethics. It's my view that these are separated not by essentials. They're probably united by essentials and shouldn't be separated. So it's probably some sort of confusion that's led to this. But, so there's some branch of ethics which is concerned with where morality comes from and what moral terms mean. Those do not seem to be well linked, but maybe they are. I'm not sure exactly what it means by that. But I just want to point out, morality comes from the fact that we are volitional creatures whose method of dealing with reality is rationality. Now, I'm not sure that you can separate volition and rationality. I'm pretty sure that they're the same thing if concepts mirror reality, which they do. So if all that's the case, then we are concerned with ethics because we are volitional or rational. Now, is that the metaethics that I'm talking about when I say that? Perhaps so.
Metaethics, which is concerned with where morality comes from and what moral terms mean. Normative ethics, which is concerned with forming standards that regulate right and wrong conduct.
So, normative ethics. Okay, what values we should hold. Alright. So on one level he's talking about the philosophy of what ethics is, and then metaethics is actual application in reality. And then there's something called applied ethics. So, application of ethics to reality doesn't cover everything. We then have to have another area where we actually apply the ethics. This last one is too much. Okay? The first two is just defining it philosophically and then applying it to reality. 1 and 2, okay? This third one is too much. Applied ethics, which is concerned with specific controversial issues. as opposed to uncontroversial issues? I mean, jumping into a bed of cactuses is controversial ethically. Werner Herzog jumped into a bed of cactuses for no reason, or for what he said reason was because no one had been injured during the filming. So when the filming was done, he jumped in a bed of cactuses. So what are we going to do with that? How are we going? What is controversial? What do you mean controversial? What is applied ethics? I think applied ethics is garbage.
And applied ethics, which is concerned with specific controversial issues, such as abortion, animal rights, climate change, capital punishment, and nuclear.
Oh, okay. A whole bunch of lefty stuff that they want to put some sort of double speak or new think over. A big mask of double speak and new think. Those are all just lefty stuff. So that last bit of ethics there is garbage. Utter garbage. Applied ethics is ethics being applied. That's it. All of these things would be in number 2 of those 3. And number 3 doesn't exist. It's Marxist garbage.
Now, since I'm predominantly concerned with meta-ethics, because that's where I see the most confusion, that's what I'm going to primarily focus on within this video. The field of meta-ethics itself...
If we had a third realm of ethics, the second realm would be personal ethics, and the third realm would be interpersonal ethics. And so the personal ethics would be what you should do concerning yourself and reality, and then the next level would be you concerning other people. And when it's you concerning a lot of other people, we call that politics. So there would be perhaps 2 levels. We could split his level 2 into 2 levels. Of course, he has just erased that fact and gone with Marxism as the 3rd level. That's strange. All right. The field of meta-ethics itself tends to be divided into 2 overarching schools.
Objectivism and relativism.
Not Ayn Rand's objectivism. Right? Objective simply meaning measurable toward reality or from reality or by reality. And Ayn Rand named her philosophy after that concept.
The former positing that morality exists as a matter of fact.
Now, as objectivists, do we say that morality exists as a matter of fact? We could say that, right? I would go ahead and say that, and I'd be able to defend that. But just because people would immediately attack it from all sorts of false directions, I would want to state it a little bit differently. I would say that morality exists as a result of facts. And you would say, well, how do we get that result? What's the extra ingredient we're missing that we can't just call it a fact as such? But I would say the missing ingredient you have is the volition of the individual concerned. If you're talking about morality, then we're obviously talking about some individual human being. You can't talk about morality divorced from humans. So you are talking about some human, and that individual and their volition, their choice, is the key ingredient in morality. If you do not choose pleasure as the goal of your life, if you choose instead to drink dishwater and wear hair shirts, that's what, I mean, there's no way to get around people that do that. If somebody chooses to jump off a bridge, or maim themselves or shoot themselves, I mean, what are you going to do? Are you going to tell those people they're immoral? Perhaps, but morality is the people who choose to live. If you choose to live, then you are going to have to do it according to your nature. Okay? So that's what he's missing here, is volition, choice. And I don't know if he's a determinist or not, probably not, but hopefully not, but that's the only thing he's missing from his all of his ruminations here.
And the latter positing that morality exists as a matter of opinion. For example, Catholicism advocates an objective meta-ethic, since it posits that morality exists as a product of divine law, and as such is comparable to any scientific law.
Okay, now that's obscene and absurd. That is objective. In any way to define religious ethics as objective is obscene.
Of opinion. For example, Catholicism advocates an objective meta.
an objective metaethics, since it posits that morality exists.
Since it posits that morality exists as a product of divine law.
Now that would mean the divine law is something other than made up arbitrary nonsense and garbage, made up by some individual human being. Alright? So, Mr. Rationality Rules here is just taking the religious people's word for it. Right? He's saying, let's not evaluate their beliefs, let's not have our own opinion of them, let's not try to figure it out, let's not have a realistic view of it, let's just take them at their word. They say that these ethics are real. So let's take them at their word and call these objective ethics. Okay? Now, that's a really stupid way to go about philosophy, I have to say. It doesn't really matter what stupid, insane claim somebody makes. You have to evaluate their ideas based on your mind and reality. Take your mind and reality and look at their ideas. You can't just accept the claims that they make at face value and go from there, which he does here, and that's obscene.
And as such is comparable to any scientific law, while cultural relativism advocates of...
And as such is comparable to any scientific law? How are religious injunctions comparable to scientific laws? Wow! That's a total breakdown of the mental order right there. That's insane. Is it because the religious people claim metaphysical authority? Like I said, you have to look a little bit deeper than their claims. You have to actually think for yourself about this stuff.
Comparable to any scientific law, while cultural relativism advocates a relativistic metaethic, since it posits that morality...
Oh, okay, so he wants to put religion as a higher order than social relativism. Right? Because social relativists advocate positive morality.
It's entirely a cultural construct.
It's just an arbitrary construct, so there's nothing objective about it. At least the religious people reach outside of man and earth and history to a God, right? Now, I'm going to stop him right there and say, no, they don't. Religious people are just more monkeys. We're all just evolved primates. Nobody has connection to a God. There is no God. So those people who do the religious thing are just exactly philosophically on the same level as the people who believe that morality is simply a social construct. Exactly epistemologically and philosophically on the same level. They are no different. Now, one of them throws out all principles and says whatever the culture comes up with is true, and the other one throws out anything the culture might come up with, and they have some book from 1,000 or 3,000 years ago or whatever. So one of them's misintegrated around some ancient myths, and the other one is totally disintegrated and doesn't want any principles at all. But philosophically, both of them are a complete mess, and they are not taking account of reality. Alright, so he is very, very confused about the nature of morality here, Mr. Rationality Rules. He would be. He's not an objectivist, so he's...
My view, however, is that morality is both objective and relative.
Now that sentence there is correct. It's relative to you, the individual, choosing. Now what's it relative to? Your choice, your volition. So I don't know if we should put relative there. I believe we could replace that word and be much more accurate and actually capture the meaning of the situation if we put volitional. Okay? Morality is objective and volitional. Volitional in the sense that you have to choose to be moral. And it's objective in the sense that doing the immoral thing will actually cause you harm, and doing the right moral thing will possibly cause you benefit. Now, doing the wrong moral thing won't necessarily cause you harm, will it? Like you steal something. But here's my point about that. You're going to take that thing home, and now you've got a little special prize you've got. Every time you look at that, or every time you remember it or think about it, say it's a candy bar and you eat it, every time you think about that, you get to remember that you stole. And if you go home and hang it on your wall or keep it on your shelf, you get to look at it, and you never get to appreciate that object for what it is, because it's always associated with another action in your mind and your guilt. So, I would say immoral actions always come with a punishment, even if nobody finds out. And moral actions, in the same sort of way, they're always going to come with a benefit, even though sometimes the benefit might be sort of invisible, just like the punishment is kind of invisible. When you take that stolen thing home and put it on your shelf, the punishment is sort of invisible, isn't it? Okay, let's see. I sort of was in a cul-de-sac of thought there. Let's get back on here. My view, however, is that morality is both objective and volitional. Right. It should be stated objective and volitional. Relative, when he says relative, he means that it's up to the individual, right? We can't have some overarching Platonic system. It has to be relative to each individual. So when he says relative, I'm going to squeeze that inside with this word objective, and I'm going to say that the individual acts in accordance with their nature. They have to be objective about their nature, the nature of reality, and look at their relation to reality, and how are they going to have to behave in reality. For what? And that's where we would put the word volition here and say to choose their own well-being or happiness. So this word relative is important, but it fits inside of this concept of being objective and volitional in morality. If you are objectively volitional in morality, or you're objectively moral with your volition, then you are going to be looking at your situation relative to reality, not some floating Platonic nonsense. You're not going to be looking at commandments or something that have no account of your situation. You're going to be looking at your situation and your choices. Alright, I think we've analyzed that sentence enough.
That is, it exists as a matter of fact, and it's relative to certain condition.
Right.
Now on the surface, because of conditioning, this might seem absurdly contradictory, but I assure you it's not. It's no more absurd than the science of health, which is a great comparison that's been utilised by the likes of Sam Harris before, because while health is rightfully acknowledged as an objective science, it's also acknowledged as a relativistic science, since facts about health are relative to species, and in some cases, individuals. Anyhow, I'm getting ahead of myself now. To back up a little, I'm going to take some advice from Voltaire and talk semantics. First off, so far as I'm concerned, words such as good, bad, right, wrong, should, shouldn't, ought, oughtn't, virtuous, evil, and indeed ethical, unethical, moral, and immoral are, I would argue, utterly meaningless without a reference. They're descriptive, and without a reference, which is granted either consciously or unconsciously, they're vacuous.
Yes, now a reference, objectivists would say a context, right? What's moral or immoral without a context is meaningless. You have to have a context.
To demonstrate this, consider the following. Is it good or moral to punch someone in the face? In general, no, it's not. But notice that by saying in general, I just assumed a reference, that being our social contract. If I assume the reference of a boxing fight, then punching someone in the face is good. In fact, it's the right thing to do. And so my point being here is that from a foundational perspective, words such as moral and immoral are meaningless. To say that something is moral is to say that something is good, and we can't say that something is good unless we have a reference. Moving on, what's the definition of objective? Because this word, in my opinion, is the sticking point for most people when it comes to morality, and I think it's because while we've largely outgrown religion, we're yet to outgrow religious language. There are two prominent conceptions of objectivity, one that's scientific and one that's philosophical. Scientists, and many philosophers, tend to view the relationship between objectivity and subjectivity as that of fact and opinion, and thus define an objective statement as a fact that isn't affected by an individual's feelings, biases, or interpretation.
Yes, now in philosophy this takes the form of Platonism, doesn't it? Because we're dealing with such abstract ideas and stuff that they want to have an abstract idea that's divorced from reality before they can say that it has any truth to it, right? They don't think that things that are connected to reality are valid because they're just subjective. We have to have things divorced from reality to be objective. Now they come to that confusion because of Immanuel Kant's philosophy, believing that reality is subjective. So they have to divorce things from the actual reality into some super real reality that's actually objective. So the source of all of this confusion he's not going to be able to exactly see here, but the source of it all is epistemology.
And therefore can typically be verified. While other philosophers and the religious tend to view the relationship between objectivity and subjectivity as that of independent of a subject and dependent on a subject, and thus define an objective statement as a statement that does not depend on a subject to exist. Now, both of these definitions suit their purpose, of course, but people often conflate and confuse them.
All right. A philosophical objective statement. Oh, I wish it didn't have the... Can I turn those off? There, good. Okay. A statement that is independent of a subject. That is not a philosophical statement. That's a floating abstraction. A scientific objective statement is a fact that isn't affected by an individual's feelings, biases, or interpretations. Okay, this is just a bunch of confusion, all right? A scientific objective fact. All right, now, if we're talking about the context of morality, this is just confused.
And they do so respect.
But a scientific objective fact is a fact that isn't affected by an individual's feelings, biases, or interpretations. True, that just does not apply to ethics, because ethics is volitional. So that is just a confusion for that to be involved in any way or to be inside of our attention span. We should not have this inside of our attention span right now. This over here is Platonism. This is Immanuel Kant, his philosophy, divorcing reality from us and from the things that we know and see. Right? We have to have a real reality that's super real, extra real. And it's separate from us. So that doesn't belong in our conversation, and this can be dismissed as a confusion. So this is unfortunate. This is kind of unfortunate, what's going on here.
Now, both of these definitions suit their purpose, of course, but people often conflate and confuse them, and they do so especially when it comes to morality. To illustrate this, consider the following question. Is it objectively the case that you are now thinking? If your answer is yes, then that's because you're using the scientific definition of objective. It's an objective fact about human thought, and it's something that we can measure, infer, and indeed verify. But if you were using the philosophical definition, your answer would necessarily be no, because this fact depends on you, a subject, to exist. The problem, of course, is that people erroneously assert that because morality is subjective in the philosophical sense, it's also subjective in the scientific sense, when this obviously isn't the case. The problem, of course, is that people erroneously assert objectively the case that you are now thinking.
Am I thinking right now? If I say yes...
If your answer is yes, then that's because you're using the scientific definition of objective. It's an
Alright, but if I say no...
Objective fact about human thought, and it's something that we can measure, infer, and indeed verify. But if you were using the philosophical definition, your answer would necessarily be no.
If I were using the philosophical definition, my answer would be no. A statement that is independent of a subject.
Your answer would necessarily be no, because this fact depends on you, a subject, to exist.
So if I believe in the philosophical definition, then because I have to exist in order to be thinking, my answer would be no, I'm not thinking right now. Did I follow him through that?
The problem, of course, is that people erroneously assert that because morality is subjective in the philosophical sense, it's also subjective in the scientific sense, when this obviously isn't the case. Anyhow, with moral semantics covered, I want to touch upon the great David Hume objective in the scientific sense, when this obviously you, a subject, to exist.
Alright, fine. Now this, if I followed him through that, that was a wreck. If I didn't follow him through that, then I don't know why.
The problem, of course, is that people erroneously assert that because morality is subjective in the philosophical sense,
Now it is subjective in the philosophical sense. But that's a confusion, okay? When they say objective, they mean divorced from reality. So it's not actually subjective in that way because that idea of objective is erroneous. All right? So if we just throw out their erroneous nonsense, whether or not you do something that harms or helps you in your life is an objective question, objectively verifiable and true. So, Just because some philosophers are confused and misuse these words doesn't mean that they are correct.
Obviously assert that because morality is subjective in the philosophical sense, it's also subjective in the scientific sense.
But it's not subjective in the philosophical sense. It is not.
It obviously isn't the case. Anyhow, with moral semantics covered, I want to touch upon the great David Hume's is or guillotine. I'll dedicate an entire video to this topic upon a time, as most people, including some otherwise reputable sources, completely misunderstand the problem. But for now, here are some brief remarks.
Alright, the is-ought dichotomy is pretty easy. If you haven't heard my summation of it yet, I'll do it real quick. Point 1. There is a thorn bush. Point 2. I ought to go around the thorn bush. Now, David Hume gets confused because between point 1 and point 2, objectivists sneak a special thing in there. We say, I'm a human being and I exist and I want to be happy and I want to live as a rational human being in accordance with my nature. So point 1, there's a cactus. Point 2, I'm a human being. I want to live in accordance with my nature and be happy. Point 3, I ought to go around the thorn bush. Now David Hume wants to do everything without point 2. Okay? He wants to get from point 1 to point 3. The ought, he wants to go from the is a cactus to I ought to go around it without having me there with a mind and with feelings and with legs and arms that will be hurt by the bushes. So that's the problem with David Hume, alright? Let's divorce everything from reality and ignore the individual in reality, and then we'll stand around being confused because we can't figure out what people should do.
Hume famously observed that people erroneously make claims about what ought to be based entirely on what is, that they attempt, but fail, to derive prescriptive conclusions from entirely descriptive facts.
Now, when I say I ought to go around the thorn bush, Hume is just going to come back to me and say, why had you ought to go around the thorn bush? There's no reason why it's particularly good for you to go around the thorn bush or not. And I say, yes there is. If I go through the thorn bush, I'm going to get cut. And I'm going to get possibly infected and could die. Right? And what's Hume going to say to that? He's going to say, but, MrCropper, why is it necessarily bad for you to be cut and to get infections and to die? Right? He cannot find something that's floating, platonic, abstract goodness that I can apply to this thorn bush situation. Right? Now, my point, of course, is I don't need any floating abstract nonsense. I can just define the good as me not being in pain or me being in pleasure, living a good, pleasurable life in accordance with my nature. And once I've got that, I know that walking through the thorn bush is bad for me and my goals and my desires. That's where I keep bringing up volition, isn't it? That's where earlier he had that definition and he should have had volition in there. Because we're just going to keep bumping up against you have to choose for yourself.
For example, consider this seemingly sound argument. Premise 1, humans typically die if they're hanged. Premise 2, Ken is a human. Therefore, we ought not to hang Ken.
Alright, this is just bizarre. This is just bizarre and it's a waste of time to go over it. That's just bizarre, it doesn't apply. What did Ken do, alright? What? Maybe if Ken killed 10 or 12 people, we ought to hang him. That's just bizarre.
And Ken is indeed a human. But how exactly are statements of fact? And what
don't assume that you can draw moral conclusions directly from statements of fact. Right.
For arguments that do. It's a brilliant observation and a very useful tip, but it's not the same as saying that morality doesn't exist or that we can't derive a valid ought, is it? So how then can we derive a valid ought? Well, it's actually very easy. It's by having a valid deductive argument that includes at least one ought. Or in other words, it's by getting an ought from an ought.
How do we get a valid ought? You start with an ought. Okay? That's not going to please anybody. I'm not pleased by that. You don't start with an ought and get an ought. You start with an individual human being who has volition. And they have to choose for themselves. And once they begin to choose, then you can start to have your ought. But first, they have to choose. First, they have to exist. Then they have to choose to exist according to their nature. They have to choose to survive. Now, it's not, you don't have to be a philosopher to choose to exist according to your nature. A caveman who feels hungry and goes out of his cave to go get some berries is acting in accordance with his nature. So you don't have to be a philosopher to do that.
For example, Premise 1, we ought to live consistently with our evolution. This is an or. Premise 2, humans evolved to eat meat. This is an is. Therefore, we ought to eat meat.
Now, that's just... This is Platonic floating Kantian garbage, okay? You're trying to come up with some sort of floating commandment, some sort of rationalistic commandment for all human beings to follow in all cases at all times. We can't even do that with murder. We've even got situations where you're okay to murder other people, or at least to kill them if murder is not the right word. For example, self-defense in your home, a woman being raped. If she shoots and kills a rapist, she's not likely to be heavily punished, not in America anyway. And war. So you're just not going to be able to divorce this shit from reality and find some floating rationalistic set of commandments. So every time you try to analyze it from that direction, of what should all humans do all the time for some reason. See, we ought to live consistently with our evolution. Why had we ought to do that? Now, if you want to be happy and stay alive, you have to live consistently with your nature. Okay? But that involves choosing. So he gets this ought. He just... Premise 1, we ought. You just start with an ought. See, that's not going to make anybody happy.
To put this in the language of mathematical logic, this argument is valid, since its conclusion does indeed follow from it.
Now, valid and sound, this is such garbage. They have formal logic. Pardon me. This is such garbage. They have these terminologies about arguments that are... They describe them as either salad, they describe them as valid or sound. They describe them as salad, that's what they do. They describe them as either valid or sound and not valid, depending on whether the structure of the argument itself is true, and then independent of reality, and then if you go check with reality, maybe it's not true. So, they have this whole thing of arguments divorced from reality having one set of descriptions and arguments applied to reality having another set of descriptions. I dismiss it all as invalid junk and a waste of time. And you'll have to decide for yourselves, ladies and gentlemen, if you study formal logic, what you yourself think about that. But he is now going to take us down the rabbit hole of these Kantian garbage concepts that are... The set of concepts is things connected to reality and things divorced from reality. Or not necessarily divorced from reality, but things that take place in some place other than reality or something like that. And it's absurd. It's absolutely absurd.
From its premises, and it's objectively verifiable, especially given recent advancements in scientific tools. But it's not necessarily sound, because most people don't believe that we ought to live consistently with our evolution. And so my point being here is that we can deduce a valid or, but whether we find it to be sound is dependent on if we personally accept.
See, so that was all just equivocation to get around that garbagey mess that he had just before, where he used an ought for his first premise.
Aspect of my moral perspective. I'm convinced that there are two types of oughts, or goods, or shoulds, or morals, etc., and I currently refer to them as axiomatic oughts and contingent oughts. Axiomatic oughts are feelings of obligation that exist self-evidently, and they do so without proof or argument. They just are. They're facts of nature. An example is my current conviction that I ought to survive. I didn't reason myself into this ought. I just have it. It's an axiomatic fact of nature, not an assumption. Now that might seem dissatisfying, but so too, at least in my opinion, are all axiomatic facts. While it's not justified, it really is the case that I have this compulsion, this awe, this impulse, this urge to behave in a certain way, and this can be objectively verified through the scientific method, and so it's a scientific fact. And what's more, thanks to Darwin, we now know precisely why I have it in the first place. Hint, no God needed. And contingent oughts are feelings of obligation that are predicated on axiomatic oughts and one or more statements of fact. And because they're predicated on statements of fact that may or may not be correct, they too may or may not be correct. To illustrate this, let's take two contingent oughts. The first being that I ought to vaccinate my child, and the second being that I ought to remove a segment of my child's genitalia.
Oh boy. Alright, well, this is getting pretty rationalistic. We're off into quite a deep mess here.
statements of fact. And because they're predicated on statements of fact that may or may not be to remove a segment of my child's genitalia, how is it that I can say that one or moral statement is right and that the other is wrong? Right, and that I ought to remove a segment of my child's genitalia.
Alright, now if the section of his genitalia you're removing is his foreskin, to prevent infections or to make infections less common and to make hygiene easier to achieve, then perhaps you ought to do that, right? Are we talking about female genital mutilation or male circumcision? Now I also realize that the circumcision thing is, even for males, is a religious thing and might not be medically valid. But it is certainly true that infections do occur in foreskin. So removing them ostensibly is a medical, it's like taking out your wisdom teeth or your pancreas, whatever, your gallbladder. It's like taking out your gallbladder or your wisdom teeth. It's taking off the foreskin, so you're less likely to get hygiene problems. So, I don't know about that one. Had I ought to vaccinate my child? I would say that you would ought to vaccinate your child, and that the schools schools should be privately run. And my school would say that you can't have a kid come to our school unless you vaccinate him. Now, if you have the government set up a institution that forces vaccinations, that's going to be abused. The government's going to abuse that, and they're going to put chemicals into people for bizarre reasons that bureaucrats decide upon, and the bureaucrats might not even know why they're deciding on it. They might just do it for money. So that is just a terribly, terribly dangerous path to go down. Just to mention off the subject. But I guess my point here is going to be, we're not learning anything from this and his equivocations and his nonsense right now. He is down a rabbit hole, and he is on the one hand, he's facing people who have bizarre definitions and he's trying to fend them off, while he tries to defend his own concept of morality without bringing volition into it. So this is just very, very strange what's going on right now.
How is it that I can say that one or moral statement is right and that the other is wrong? Well, it's by viewing them in their entire context. Unlike axiomatic oughts, contingent oughts are, well, contingent on premises, and in both of these cases they're contingent on the same axiomatic ought, that being, I ought to prevent my child from suffering, and at least one statement of fact, or is statement. And so, syllogistically, the first argument goes as follows. Premise 1, I ought to prevent my child from suffering. Premise 2, it is the case that vaccinating my child will reduce her chances of suffering. Therefore, I ought to vaccinate my child.
True as far as it goes. Now let's just not make that a law, or else the government will abuse it, okay?
And the second argument goes, Premise 1, I ought to prevent my child from suffering. Premise 2, it is the case that removing a segment of my child's genitalia will reduce her chances of suffering.
Why do you put in her? But that's fine. He's talking about he can't conceive of an actual situation where point 2 would be to the benefit of human life, but and then that I'm not even saying that it is. I'm not even saying that it is. But why her? Why not his?
Therefore, I ought to remove a segment of my child's genitalia. Now, both of these arguments are valid, as their conclusions follow from their premises, but only one of them is sound. And so the reason I can say that the vaccine ought is correct, or sound, and that the circumcision ought is incorrect, or unsound, is because it is indeed scientifically, objectively the case, given the current conditions, that vaccinating a child will reduce their chances of suffering, and it is not objectively the case, given the current conditions, that removing a
Since it's not the case that Allah exists, or by extension that hell exists, or that blah blah blah, you get it. Okay, so that is... he's talking about female genital mutilation, not male circumcision. Maybe he would make the same case for male circumcision. Certainly the same case has been made, and Lisa Van Dam's among them.
Segment of a child's genitalia will reduce their chances of suffering. Thus, the former is right because its premises are correct, and the latter is wrong because its second premise is incorrect. Now again, we can quarrel about the axiomatic or, but here's the thing. If you already accept it, for whatever reason, or, let's face it, lack thereof, then for all intent and purposes, what's the problem? Nature has made it so that we are born with axiomatic oughts, and while, again, this is intellectually dissatisfying, we just have to get on with it.
So that's his ultimate answer, I think. That this may be intellectually dissatisfying to you people out there who want some rationalistic, floating, otherworldly, Kantian, divorced from this reality way to define the good. Tough luck. We are born with pain receptors, we're born with a brain that wants pleasure of certain kinds, and we should evaluate morality within this context. So he does pretty good. I'm going to give him like a B+ on this video. He's not perfect. He never discovered volition. Not explicitly anyways. I mean, he realizes that it's there, I think. But because of that definition we had earlier, I can say that he does not appreciate volition. Where was it? I'm just going to bring it up real quick if I can find it. I can't find it, so now we're just going to have to forget about it, not worry. Alright, now we only have a little bit left before we're caught up to the part where we were.
Inconvenient as it might be, we are not born with a blank slate, and all moral discourse must, finally, accept this brute fact. Anyhow, to sum up, I do not believe,
So we're a blank slate in some respects, but we have a nature. Aristotle's blank slate is that we don't have inherent ideas. We might have pain receptors, but not inherent ideas.
example, that it's always morally wrong to murder. There's no transcendent objective law that we must abide by, and I don't believe that we must do anything. But I do believe, as a matter of scientific fact, that we are born with intrinsic axiomatic values, goals, and inclinations, or in other words, axiomatic oughts, and that we construe contingent oughts in reference to these axiomatic oughts and perceived facts. And because those facts can be erroneous, so too can the contingent oughts, an objective law that we must abide by, and I don't believe that we must do anything. But
there we go.
And I don't believe that we must do anything.
I don't believe that we must do anything. Okay. So there he is at 10 minutes and 46, 7 and 8 seconds. He says the key that could unlock his whole video and really allow him to understand this subject fully. We don't have to do anything.
And I don't believe that we must do anything.
There's no must. It's only choice. It's only volition that is the key. Okay? That is the key that unlocks morality for objectivists. You have to choose. If you choose to live, then you're going to have to live as a rational human being. Okay? That's the key. Alright, well, I think we're done with this, gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in, ladies and gentlemen. I've been a little bit less active recently than I would have liked, but some of you were upset a couple weeks ago that I was posting too many videos, and you said, Cropper, why don't you hold them back and just let one out once in a while? But I knew that that period of bliss was not going to last, and something would interrupt me. I went out to my car the other day, and the treads was coming off the front of one of the tires, and so I had to take it to the tire shop, and I had to get 4 new tires on the damn thing. I knew that this was coming, but I was hoping they would last at least a few months longer. They had a lot of tread left. They were just dry rotted. Just old tires. And so I got those replaced. That took a whole afternoon, and that set other things into the next day anyways. So I've been busy, but I will be being active again like I was in the past once my situation allows. Please jump on Patreon, give me $5 or $10 a month, and try to get me up to some level where I can make this a regular thing and not worry about having to drop it so I can work 2 jobs all the time. If you support what I do, ladies and gentlemen, please patronize me. Thank you for tuning in. This has been MrCropper with Rationality Rules.